The UEFA Women's Euros kick off next Wednesday, where the Lionesses will be looking to retain their title from 2022. But yet again, a number of key players are missing due to injuries to the anterior cruciate ligament, or the ACL. This issue really came to the forefront ahead of the 2023 World Cup, when nearly 30 players were ruled out of the tournament due to ACL injuries. Just in the England team, Beth Mead, Fran Kirby and captain Leah Williamson were all ruled out of the squad with ACL injuries. This month, we're taking a closer look at the science underpinning the ACL and why women are 6 times more likely to suffer from these injuries, and what research is being done to understand it. We'll hear from Blake Rivers, the lead researcher on a piece of FIFA-funded research at Kingston University, which will be looking at the impact of the menstrual cycle on these injuries, as well as Grace Vella, a footballer and owner of women's football apparel brand Miss Kick, who is currently going through rehab from her ACL reconstructive surgery. Blake's research is one of the 12 projects being funded by the FIFA Research Scholarship in 2025. But his background is in biomechanics, which helps us begin with understanding what the ACL is actually for and what role it plays in movement.
The ACL is one of 4 major ligaments in the knee, which basically helps to stabilise the structure. So obviously you have the thigh bone and the corresponding tibia and fibula below, which is the shin bones. The ligaments basically help keep those 2 bones attached. The ACL specifically, the anterior cruciate ligament, stops the anterior tibial translation to occur, which is basically where the motion of the shin bone moves away from the thigh bone. So that's its main function. It also helps to support stability in internal rotation, external rotation. That is pretty much its specific function.
When you hear about the ACL in a sports setting, a lot of the time it's when it's torn or injured, and most of the time you seem to hear about that in football. Is it a football-specific injury, or do we get it in other sports as well?
No, it's definitely not football-specific, but it is the patterns of football-specific. So usually in sports where there's some sort of external reaction involved, for example, it's also very prevalent in basketball. We hear about it in rugby, and even in sports like tennis. Another big sport that it happens in is skiing, because of the fixed position of the shin. And as we just spoke about, that motion resistance, it can be quite problematic. But in team sports specifically, because of the reactive nature of the game and the element of having to change direction, sprint, jump, all of these combined means that it's very problematic within that sport.
It's big changes of pace as well. I guess you're permanently moving, and when you're pivoting, that really puts a lot of strain on your body.
Absolutely. Pivoting is probably the motion considered most likely to cause a rupture, which is due to basically the fact that because the ligament's function is to resist translation, it's only so long. It's a very small ligament, really. But when we rotate the position of the shin, that creates more length, which causes it to rupture. So when we have that pivoting rotation moment with the forward translation, with the force, it's like a catalyst for rupture.
If you're someone who follows women's football, it seems like every other month we're hearing of another major player either completely rupturing their ACL or injuring it in some way. But like you said, when you actually sit back and consider it as an injury, it's probably one of the worst injuries you could get as a professional footballer. Why is it that women seem to be more likely to injure their ACL?
Yeah, this is obviously a pretty key component of what's happening now, is understanding this exact outcome. And I think these do still happen in the men's game, which indicates very clearly that there is a mechanic-based reason that this is occurring. However, it's up to 6 times more likely in football that women will have this injury. I think it's important to zoom out first away from my research scope and look at the game as a whole. Especially at the elite level, the sport is growing rapidly. There's a huge economic growth in the sport. Participation is rising pretty much year on year. And the influence of, I suppose, social media, the popularity of players in the game, and sponsorship and things like that means that it is growing impressively fast, which is amazing, and I love that. Unfortunately, maybe the physical preparation component isn't quite the same as the men's game. When you look at the evolution of the elite players through the academy systems and things like that, the infrastructure in the male game is much more robust, which is possibly leading to the idea that female athletes aren't quite as prepared when they get to the elite level. Also, because of the factors I just mentioned, the scheduling of the female game is much more compact now. There's much more being done in shorter timeframes. You see it all the time now where there's pretty much no opportunity to not be competing in the women's game, which is obviously problematic from a tolerance standpoint. But when we look at specifically factors that relate more to my discipline, which is biomechanics, from a movement standpoint, the female anatomy is different to the men's in terms of hip structure. You might have heard of things like Q angle, which is the orientation of the thigh bone relative to the position of the pelvis. That makes a difference on the position of the knee. There's also specific factors in the knee, such as the width of the intercondylar notches. So to say that in a more layman's term, the space of the articulating ends of the thigh bone is smaller in a woman than a man, which can mean that basically there's a smaller pocket for the ligament to sit inside. So that within itself can be a factor too. In terms of bringing in the menstrual cycle and the hormonal element, this is still something that isn't as understood as we would like, purely because of the difficulty in measuring it. But what we are understanding in terms of, I think it's worth addressing the two primary female sex hormones, which are estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen has an impact on ligament laxity. Laxity meaning how pliant a ligament is, how stretchy is it. So as estrogen rises, so does the laxity of the ligament. And this isn't just for the ligament of the ACL, this is for multiple ligaments, which basically means that there are times where the ligament is more likely to stretch, and as a consequence, the chances of it rupturing are potentially higher. When we look at progesterone, which is most active in the mid-luteal phase of the cycle, this can actually have more of a role on the neuromuscular system and cause an inhibition of the neuromuscular system within motion, which means that basically the movements may not be being completed as effectively as in other phases. Obviously, the scope of this research is still, I guess, very uncertain because of the level of accuracy and validity in the outcome of the takings. But we do know that there is definitely female sex-specific factors that are at play.
And I think so much of that is focused on the money actually being put behind this research, because even if people know that it's something that needs to be investigated, if there's not the specific funding allocated to that, then it's not going to be understood properly. Speaking of, your research study was announced at the end of April, which will specifically be looking at the menstrual cycle as an affecting factor in ACL injuries. And it really hit the headlines. As a women's football fan, it was all over my feed, but it got picked up by the BBC, ESPN, Reuters. There was even a post on Versus, which is a huge football media platform known for its very poetic captions. So could you take us through a bit of the backstory of how this research and funding came about?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it was a bit of a shock to all of us that it had the publication that it did. I think we just realized that given our previous experience and interest in, I suppose, tissue mechanics and ligament mechanics, we realized that this is an area that simply isn't being looked at enough. It was very clear to see that there was a distinct gap in the research, and specifically in the robustness of the methodologies, so the quality of the research being done. I worked previously for Kingston as a research assistant on a different ACL project, and when we realized that this project has the capacity to be expanded further, it was then converted into a PhD, which is why I'm doing it right now. The funding was something that we had applied for personally, as in order to actually achieve the gold standard of testing, which is intravenous blood sampling, so taking blood directly from the vein, we would need money to achieve that outcome. And as such, we proposed our project to a FIFA scholarship organization, and we were lucky enough to be selected.
You touched on this a little bit, but how much research does exist in this area, and what gaps are you hoping to fill with your own study to take that one step further?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely research that has been done. I would say there's been a healthy amount over the last decade or two. The problem lies in the quality of the research done. So there was a big paper that came out about 2 years ago, which basically said that little to none of the research is endocrinologically accurate, which means that a lot of the hormonal analysis done or the tracking was done basically via their perspective. So relying on the athlete's truth as opposed to validating the bloods hormonally, which is a real problem, because it's like you saying that I am ovulating because I'm ovulating. I need to know for a fact that you're ovulating. So the approach that has been taken in the past has basically inhibited the quality of the outcome. Another problem we have is very poor measuring of confounding factors. So this might be things like sleep, nutrition, training, performance status, so what level you're competing at, and the sport you play. So we might be trying to apply data to movements that aren't related to the sport we're looking at, which is specifically football. So that is pretty much what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to both simultaneously do the highest quality in-lab analysis we can for ACL movements or ACL risk-based movements, and the gold standard in hormonal analysis via blood sampling.
What will this research actually look like? You mentioned needing intravenous blood samples and looking at specific associated movements, but how will this all be put together?
Yeah, it's quite rigorous. So we begin by verifying 3 cycles before we ever really do anything in the labs, because we want to understand as much as we can the individual that we're working with and their cycle, because there's so much variance between females and their menstrual cycles. We want to make sure that we have complete accuracy with the individual in front of us. From that point, we then actually test 3 phases within a single cycle. And this will include 3 lab sessions. So we actually do the entire thing each session. So what this looks like is arriving at the lab, performing some blood analysis. So where we take a blood sample, a very small amount. From that point, we then allow an opportunity to rest. And then basically we complete a pretty thorough biomechanical analysis of all the movements that we think are considered related to risk. So I'll break that down for you. There's 3 major things we're looking at, which is force, muscle activity, and 3D analysis of the joints. So the protocol itself is looking at the strength and the quality of the motion of the hamstring and the quadricep muscles. We're then looking at 3D analysis and electromyography of a number of movements, which include single leg drop jumps, double leg drop jumps from a height, an unplanned change of direction where they have to react to a light and cut in a direction that's around 45 degrees. We're also looking at decelerations as well, and potentially a few other things. So while we're doing this, we have them marked up, complete skeleton with 3D reflective markers, and we put electrical myographical sensors on muscles from the hip downwards. So by doing this, we basically receive a load of variables around what the joints and the muscles are doing within those motions. And then basically what we're looking at is what is happening hormonally at each of those testing points, which is the onset of menses, so early follicular phase when menstruation begins. We're then looking at the point of ovulation. So we test for a positive ovulatory urine sample. And when we receive that, we have a 24 to 48 window to verify in the lab, which is the complex element. And then we do a week post-ovulation, which takes us around to mid-luteal phase. And that then gives us our 3 opportunities within the cycle to look at what's happening.
And how are those 3 specific points within the cycle decided?
Yeah, so based on the literature that's been done, these are the 3 points that are considered the most hormonally varied. So we would say there's more closer to 4 specific phases, but one of them, which is the late follicular phase, is very difficult to test because the follicular phase is the most malleable in terms of length, and ovulation can occur at very random points. But in terms of measuring the 3 specific phases which is early follicular, or when the individual is menstruating, ovulation, and mid-luteal, they have very different hormonal characteristics. So during menstruation, estrogen and progesterone are both very low. Then around the point of ovulation, we see this big rise in estrogen that occurs right before it, and very low progesterone. And then towards the mid-luteal phase, we see the highest peak of progesterone and a small secondary peak in estrogen. So from an endocrinological or a hormonal standpoint, they are very distinct, which means that it is the best opportunity to see the influence that they each have respectively on movement-related factors.
I'm sure people who have periods have identified the times in their own cycle where they feel most at risk of injuring themselves or just tend to take it easier. Are these self-identified times in the cycle the same as the ones that you actually see in practice in the research, or do they vary?
That's a great question. I think social media has a big role to play in terms of female athletes that are rupturing their ligaments, giving their perspective on when it was occurring. We do often hear and see self-reported ruptures around the period itself or menstruation. I also am looking at the subjective experience of female athletes and identifying where they perceive points of, vulnerability to be occurring in terms of risk of injury. And it is often around menstruation, and it makes sense because hormonally there's a lot of adverse experiences. It's a pretty painful thing for some people. However, in the literature, this is still very muddy. There is actually some suggestion that, similar to what I said earlier in terms of the influence that rises in estrogen can have on laxity and progesterone can have on the neuromuscular system, there is actually some evidence to suggest that the highest risk period may be closer to ovulation or the mid luteal phase. However, there is no clear consensus on if this is a true outcome or not, as we do still see ACL injuries occurring at any point during a cycle.
And I think there's such individual differences with these kind of things as well. So there's only so much of a consensus you can reach.
Absolutely. And that's pretty much the reason why, despite looking at multiple women and having some sort of correlative outcome, we really want to know specifically what the individual is relative to their hormonal fluctuations and their movements. So it's very likely that we will see some differences between individuals in our study.
To get a consistent data set, you need the same individual coming in for these 3 different tests, which is a relatively big commitment, especially if you want these high standard players coming in. So what has the attitude from clubs been like in terms of encouraging their players to give the time to the research?
It's definitely a major consideration for us because we appreciate that it is quite involved. Fortunately, due to the fact that this is such important research, we have had a really good buy into that. Ideally, we'd like to look at players across all playing levels. So we're also looking to include some of the sort of sub-elite grassroots levels as well to have a comparative point between individuals. But luckily, I think because this is the first time this is being done to this level, to my knowledge, that we have had a pretty good response from even the elite levels. We are still trying to cross the bridge of understanding what it is that we can do to not interfere with schedules. Ideally, we'd work around that by testing at, lower points in the season or pre-season if we can. But that is obviously just a consideration in science in general, that to be able to do the things we want to do and have the outcome we have to have, there will just need to be a level of buy-in. Ideally, we would collaborate specifically with 1 or 2 clubs. The beauty of being in central London is that we have got some good connections. So we hope to leverage that as much as we can.
You also mentioned getting different levels of players involved, like those at grassroots clubs. In order to eliminate all those confounding variables, you need people who play on different types of pitches and things like that come into play with how injury susceptibility can vary. So it's also in the best interest of your research to make sure you've got an even representation of players.
Absolutely. And we know that this is happening at all levels as well. This isn't just an elite level injury. This is occurring from very young girls all the way through to older women at all levels of the game. So we know that there is a huge hormonal influence. So we just need to, basically our goal is to answer the question with the best answer that's yet been given, which is always the goal of science, is to better improve the outcome of our knowledge. But hopefully that either furthers our recognition of what is happening within the individual, or can ask better questions. Okay, what else is happening in the female game that we can look at? Because this is certainly multifaceted. So hopefully we can contribute our bit.
Still to come, we'll hear from Grace Vella about her own experiences going through an ACL reconstruction and rehab, and the wider context of this research and how it would be put into practice. Grace, hello. Thank you for joining me. You played for Liverpool and Manchester City at the youth level and have played throughout the tiers of English football, now playing for Chorley Football Club. Throughout your time in the game, how have you found that interest and attention has changed towards research into kind of understanding injuries within the women's game?
Yeah, I think it's changed massively, especially over recent years. When I was younger, the women's game just isn't what it is today. And when I was at Liverpool at the academy, for example, we were fighting for the basics like training wear and facilities. So research into injuries wasn't kind of even on the radar. And I think, especially as the game has become more professional over the past 10 years and the Lionesses have become household names, I think it's really shone a light on the lack of research and understanding into women's football injuries. I think it was Leah Williamson and Beth Meads, as an example, who missed the last World Cup because of ACL injuries, and just the number of players in the WSL who were out because of similar issues. I think it's really highlighted the problem. I think more people care about women's football now. So they're going to notice if their star player like Viv Miedemar or Sam Kerr isn't playing, which I think puts pressure on clubs to find a solution. And I think the professional players in particular have done an amazing job in bringing attention to the problem. I know, for example, they went to the PFA and they explained how vital it was that there was more research into ACL injuries, and there was a specific project launched around that. So I think it's definitely heading in the right direction. I still don't feel like there's 100% clarity on why, as women, we are more susceptible to knee injuries. But I think that's just kind of down to the lack of historical research and data that we've got to go off. But the critical research is being done now, so I'm sure we'll have more answers in the future, which I think is only a positive thing.
You personally sustained an ACL injury during a match against Doncaster, I believe, and learned in January of this year that you'd need reconstructive surgery. I wanted to thank you for agreeing to speak about it, because I know it's a really tough injury and recovery and can be quite sensitive. So I really appreciate you kind of being open with it and agreeing to chat to me about it. Could you just talk a bit about your experience with the injury and how the process has been so far?
Yeah, sure. So I'd actually had a bit of a break from playing football for a few years just because I wanted to focus on growing my business, but decided last season that I was going to go and play again and sign for Chorley. And yeah, it was in December and we were away at Doncaster. And to be honest, the pitch wasn't great. It was super slippery. And within 6 minutes into the game, I'd basically gone to try and win the ball and tackle this girl, and she's knocked me slightly off balance and my legs just carried on going in the mud. And I remember the sensation, like I felt this pop in my knee, and I kind of just knew in that moment what that meant. Like the pain
Yeah.
actually wasn't that bad, but I don't know if that was just because I was so overwhelmed by the situation, but I was in absolute floods of tears just because I knew deep down what had happened. So I left the game with my dad, and at this point my knee had swollen a lot, and I booked in to see a physio 5 days later. And funnily enough, they do this test with an ACL and they kind of like pull it a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, I don't think it's your ACL ligament. So at this point, I was like, maybe it's not as bad as we'd first hoped.
Yeah.
And I was explaining that a lot of the pain was down the left hand side of my knee. So he thought maybe it was like my LCL, which the recovery on that type of ligament isn't as long. So he advised anyway, I book him for a scan to be sure. So I actually paid for a private scan, and I did this because I knew on the NHS I would have been waiting weeks and weeks.
Mm.
And I had the scan and it came back probable ACL rupture. So I was devastated.
Yeah.
Um, I think the biggest concern for me was around getting the surgery. You know, I'm not a professional athlete. I didn't have private medical insurance. And for you to pay for a private ACL reconstruction, you're looking at around £10,000, which I
Wow.
just didn't have.
Yeah.
And I'd known from speaking to other players that on the NHS you could be waiting between 6 to 9 months just for the operation, and the recovery from that operation is 9 to 12 months. So you're potentially looking at not playing for nearly 2 years. So
Yeah.
I think that was my biggest concern at the time. But because I paid for this private scan, I think it really sped things up for me. And when I went to my GP and I met the consultants, I just explained that football's my life, it's my job, like this is going to impact everything. And I was extremely, extremely fortunate that I was fast tracked and there was actually a cancellation. So from the point of injury in December to having the operation, it was just over 2 months, which is completely unheard of.
Yeah.
So I'm extremely grateful for that. The operation itself, I was very scared because I'd never been in hospital before and I'd never even gone under anaesthetic. But I was just so emotional on the day and I was just so grateful because I knew how lucky I was to kind of be in that position. I can't lie, like the coming out of the operation, it was very tough.
Yeah.
I basically had to learn to walk again, and as someone who's very active and very independent, having to rely on people around me to get me up out of bed and get me down the stairs for a couple of weeks was really tough. Um, but now I'm 18 weeks post-op and I'm looking to start running again next week. So I'm really buzzing about that. But yeah, according to my physio and my rehab coach, my recovery has been pretty straightforward so far anyway. And I think one thing they've put that down to is actually when I went into my operation, a lot of people who do the injury kind of just sit still and wait. And that's the worst thing you can do. The best way to recover is to go into that operation as strong as possible. So um I was doing, because a lot of people think after 2 weeks, I was basically back in the gym doing certain exercises and without an ACL, which is crazy, but doing that actually put me in good stead afterwards. And yeah, it's been a journey, and I've still got at least another 6 months to go, but I'm out the worst of it now, and yeah, I'm on the mend, which is the main thing.
Yeah, it's great news that it's looking like you're on the right track, and getting back to running is very exciting. To go into the surgery a little bit more and what that process looks like, with reconstructive surgery, you generally get your ACL replaced with a graft using either tissue from another part of your own body, so from the patient, which is an autograft, or you could get tissue from a donor, which is then an allograft. And which graft you get depends on loads of different factors like sex, age, which sport, or how you got the injury, and all sorts of things that come into play with that decision. So what did that decision look like in your case? Was it something that happened behind closed doors, or was it a conversation that you were involved with as well?
Yeah, so I again had quite a unique experience in that when I met with my consultant, he gave me the choice of what type of graft I wanted. I could I went for an autograft, so I didn't know you could have an allograft. That's something that I've learned on this podcast. But
Yeah.
yeah, I had the choice of either a hamstring graft or a patella tendon graft. And I think in speaking to my physio, it comes down a lot. A lot of the decision is based on the surgeon. So the
Mm-hmm.
surgeon will have a preference in terms of what graft that they like to do, but mine was just like, which one do you want? So I was kind of sat there thinking, I don't know.
Yeah,
You
you
tell
wouldn't know,
me.
would you?
But I spoke with my physio and my rehab team, and they advised that I'd go for the patella tendon graft. So that's the one that comes from the front of your knee. And the advice around that was based on my physio explaining that there is some really, really early research highlighting that potentially in women that graft is better. And also my rehab coach, he works with lots and lots of ACL injuries, sadly, and he mentioned how with a hamstring graft, you're basically injuring another part of your body
Mm-hmm.
to then put onto your kneecap, whereas at least with the patella tendon graft, it's all kind of in one location and you can just rehab that one area. And also with a hamstring graft as well, you can have further complications in the future around speed and the flexibility of that hamstring. And I'm not the quickest player, to be honest, as it comes. So the thought of being potentially even slower, I was like, nope, I'm gonna go
Yeah,
for
you don't want to sacrifice that.
yeah, no, I'm gonna go for that option. But both options are successful, otherwise they wouldn't offer them. But that's the one that I went for in the end. And they also did this additional procedure as well, which is called an LET. So it's a lateral extra articular tenodesis, which is used on athletes and people who play high impact sports. So I had an additional procedure where they took a part of my IT band, which is on the side of my leg, and they call it a bit like a seatbelt. So they just put it over the top of the ACL reconstruction, and that just, especially because my plan is to go and return back to football, it just decreases the chance of re-rupturing. So yeah, I got the choice, which was interesting.
Yeah, so I guess if you're getting the graft from the patella, it's also, like you said, kind of creating another injury in itself. But is that all integrated into the recovery? So it's all just kind of packaged into one?
Yeah, so I know my rehab is centered around this specific surgery. So I know with a hamstring graft, there's a lot of focus on building that hamstring strength again. Whereas for me, my issue with there's going to be issues with any kind of surgery, but the issue with the patella one is there's quite a lot of pain in the front of the kneecap, which I have experienced. But again, they've just adapted my rehab to make sure that I'm building up the muscles around my knee stronger, and especially before I go into my exercises, I spend a bit more time activating the patella tendon and things like that, just to try and minimize that pain.
This is obviously an injury that doesn't just affect players at the top level. Anyone can tear their ACL. What needs to be done to kind of match those top levels throughout so that every tier has the right support?
Unless you're playing in the WSL and you're at a big club, you're kind of left out of the system and the support mechanisms in place. So what I learned was that if you're in the WSL and you're a professional player, the PFA actually have a pot of money that can go towards supporting you if you suffer an injury. But these players at the top, they have access to everything anyway. Um,
Yeah, they're not the ones that need it.
exactly. And then players who play at my level, which is kind of semi-professional, we have jobs outside of football, tier 3 or tier 4. You're playing football and your life's around it. The demands are on you. But if you go and suffer an injury, you don't have that support in place. And that kind of leaves you in this grey area of having to go out and either wait on the NHS, or you've seen girls crowdfund or do a GoFundMe to pay for the surgery. And I think there kind of needs to be something in place for those players and players at grassroots level, because like you say, anyone can have that kind of injury. So I would love a solution for that. And I think we know women and girls are 6 times more likely to suffer a non-contact ACL, but there's no provision in place for if that happens. So yeah, I can't complain because my experience was unbelievable, but I think I was extremely lucky, and I can't speak highly enough of the NHS and the surgery and the support I've had from them, but I'm probably one in 1,000 who've had that. And an ACL injury is so long, it can affect your whole entire life, it can affect your work, and I think we need to find I don't know what that solution is, but something that supports players who aren't professionals to have what I've had. I'm very, very fortunate that, I pay for all my private physio. I pay a lot of money, hundreds of pounds every month, and I'm just lucky that I'm in a position to do that. So you've also got to think about not just the surgery, which costs £10,000, but the rehab, the weekly physio sessions that's going to cost thousands of pounds as well. And I'm just fortunate that I'm in a position to afford that, but that's not the case. Might not be the case for other girls and women. And so yeah, that would be. We see this, the PFA doing the stuff for the WSL professionals. I want to see something for the mid-tier players who also are at risk of this injury and deserve some sort of support in whatever way that looks like.
And you've been really open with documenting your journey on social media, doing kind of weekly updates on your progress and what you're doing in the gym and what stage of the rehab you're at. What made you decide to be so transparent about that? Because like you said, it's a really tough thing to go through. So being open about that must come with its own challenges as well.
Yeah, I think I remember when I first done the injury, and you kind of turn to social media for a bit of advice, which probably isn't the best kind of source of information. And I remember going online and finding it really difficult to understand what was going to happen at what stage. Because for me, I like to know what's ahead of me, and I like to be able to set goals and plan. And I couldn't figure out from what I was viewing online, like when am I going to run again? When can I jump again? And of course, it's different for each person, but it's good to kind of have a benchmark and a milestone to aim for. So I thought, this has happened to me. Let's try and turn this into a positive in some capacity. And I just thought, let's just start documenting it week by week. I think, firstly, because I want to raise awareness around the issue, and especially with what I do with Miss Kick, like I've always been about growing the game, advocating for women in sport, and I thought, sadly there's going to be girls who are going to go through this as well. So if I can create a bit of a content plan around what that could potentially look like, it could give them a bit of help in the future. And to be honest, the response has been amazing. I get quite a few messages from people saying how my videos have helped them, or it's supported them with their rehab, which is exactly what it's there to do. But then I think also this injury is so long and the rehab is so long. Like I'm looking at between 9 to 12 months recovery. So I think from a personal point of view as well, being able to look back and say, I have come a long way. Sometimes week by week, you kind of don't see the progress, but being able to reflect on, gosh, like 5 weeks ago, I couldn't even walk. It kind of gives you that spurs you on in the tough times as well. So yeah, and I love content creation anyway and social media. So I just thought, why not use that skill set to create something and see what that could also lead to as well.
I think it's such a huge space for women's football at the moment as well. There's so many fans that kind of find their clubs through social media or follow their favourite players through social media. And often, I think intentionally, if, players in big clubs injure their ACLs, their treatment can be kept relatively under wraps because, they don't want false rumours that someone's coming back when they're not, and all of that speculation flies around. So I can completely understand why that's done. But I think it's probably also really refreshing for people to actually know what that process looks like in much kind of finer detail, with having regular updates of what exercises you're doing, and those really fine details I think people will find really insightful and interesting as well, and probably haven't got that insight before.
Yeah, definitely. That's exactly the whole purpose of it. As someone who went through it and then couldn't find that information online. And yeah, hopefully people will follow the journey all the way through, and yeah, even just to like look back on in a few, like a year's time, just to be able to remember that journey. I think it'll be good.
ACL injuries are, as much as there's still a load of research that needs to be done and is starting to happen, was any of that spoken about when you were playing kind of at the youth level? How much has that conversation changed? Is it just completely unrecognizable now, or were there whispers of it early on?
There was literally, I didn't even know what an ACL was probably when I was growing up. I didn't know about this type of injury. I think looking back, there was maybe 2 players in that maybe like 7 years of going through the academy who had a knee injury. But I think just because of the demands on players nowadays, that we are at an increased risk and there are more and more girls suffering the injury. So yeah, when I was younger, it kind of wasn't on the radar whatsoever. Whereas now, every other week, someone's done their ACL. Even in my game, for example, the Doncaster players warming up with a shirt on with this girl's number on. And I was like, what's that for? And they were like, the game before, the girl had come back from her ACL and had done it again, her first game back,
Really?
in a bad tackle. And I remember literally in the change room thinking that's awful, that. And then
Yeah.
10 minutes later, I've gone out and done
Yeah.
mine. So like it's sad because it's so common, but on the brighter side of things, the research is being done now, and there's, I think in 5-10 years time, when we really truly understand what's causing this, we can change the protocols, we can change the training schedules of women to suit women, and if it is hormones, if it is equipment, boots, if it is the pitches, we can make those changes to hopefully eradicate and reduce the risk. So yeah, it's come on leaps and bounds, but I think it's only going to keep on going over the next 10 years, and I'm excited to see what the findings are.
Research like Blake's is obviously pivotal in helping to advance our understanding of problems in the women's game. But how do the findings of this research actually get put into practice?
That's a great question, and probably the most important one, because there is obviously inherently a risk to knowledge, which is that what do we do if we find something important? How do we implement that? I suppose for me, it is simply to just understand as well as we can what is happening. The goal would probably be some sort of educational component coming from this, in terms of understanding what coaches, scientists, and players can do to better understand themselves as the athlete or the athlete they're working with. It's very difficult for me to be able to say what we can meaningfully produce from this, other than potentially just more science. But there does have to come a point. One of the things I'm working on currently is education for the grassroots level and for younger women, and I suppose as well understanding the stigma. I'm also very interested in communication in the game, which is quite problematic. Obviously, I'm a male scientist working with female athletes, so I'm very aware of the complications that can come from gender. But I think that if we can produce something that helps us understand what to implement later on, that is obviously the key. There's also a lot happening now in terms of women tracking their cycles, understanding their the role their hormones play, and also the role of contraception as well is pretty big. So it'd be really nice to be able to support that area by basically just validating better approaches. In terms of from a more coaching standpoint, because I'm also a strength and conditioning coach, it'd be really nice to use the ACL screening tools we have to better recognize maybe specific movement factors that are a problem, and addressing how we can improve the quality of the strength and proprioceptive factors in female athletes. So basically addressing the physical components as opposed to just the hormonal would be amazing.
So this study will be looking at players from UK clubs, most likely those based in London, but obviously all these clubs have players coming from all over the world. Is this an area of research that is being looked at internationally, or are we trying to pave the way for it in the UK?
I definitely think this is something that is being done much more globally, and I've had a lot of interaction with people in America, especially in Canada. I think there's a huge movement towards that because collegiate sport there is massive. I've definitely had more experiences of communicating with people in America for other sports as well, as opposed to, I think in England especially, football is the front running sport for women, and it is huge. So I would say that we're doing some very cool things, and I think there's some amazing scientists in England doing some really great stuff. But I'd say through parts of Europe and America, yeah, there's definitely a movement towards it. And I think because the level of quality is being raised, I think we should see that across the continents as well.
As we mentioned at the start, your research is being funded by a FIFA research scholarship. How significant is it that it's someone like FIFA?
To tell you the truth, I think the response that this study has had has made me realise just how important that is. I initially was maybe a little bit naive to the reality of how much this research was wanted. So it's really, really nice to see the response we've had. And I think having people as big as FIFA involved shows an interest. And I'm hoping that this is one small step to opening the door to other research areas as well, especially in terms of the footballing structure. I hope that FIFA invest in other areas of the women's game as well. But yeah, I think it's massive. I think the response has been super positive, and I certainly realised how much research is being done on this topic. So if the funding can align with that from larger bodies, I think we're in a really positive position to dig into the bones of what's happening here.
As we've heard from Grace and Blake, it's an extremely exciting time for the women's game as we finally see the research getting the funding it deserves. But there's still a huge amount we don't understand, so make sure you stay tuned with how Blake's research goes. But in the meantime, enjoy the Euros, and we'll see you next month.